In the middle of the week, he puts a stop to sacrificing grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. And that's the reading of the passage itself. So, Daniel chapter 9, verses 24, 25, 26, 27. Okay, let's begin to take a bite out of some of the commentary that swirls around this particular passage. You already know that I'm a futurist perspective. I hold largely to the idea that the book of Revelation is primarily a future-facing book, meaning there are events that John wrote about that are still yet future. When it comes to the book of Daniel, however, it's safe for me to take many of the details that the preterists bring to the table, along with some of the idealists and historicists, and put them on the table and examine them and agree with many of them. For instance, in this prophecy about Daniel in the 70 weeks, like we looked at in the chart, let me jump back over to Brother Parr's chart for a moment. Or, no, I'm sorry, not that one. Let me look at this one for a second. If you notice, the 70 weeks of Daniel, which I believe are 490 years of 365, 360-day years. So this is why, I apologize for not mentioning this earlier, but because to me it's just apparent, it's obvious, but to others who might not have heard this before, maybe this throat goes over your head. When we're talking about 490 years, we're not talking about Gregorian calendar years like we use today, 365-day years. We're talking about biblical years, which are 360 days, more like lunisolar calendar, where we have months that are clocked off every 30 days or so. The ancient Hebrews used this type of calendar. Modern Jews today use the modern calendar that most of us use as well when it comes to living your everyday life, 365-day, Gregorian calendar. But when it comes to religious studies, they still hold to the religious calendar, which is 30-day months. Prophetically speaking, the 490 years must be made up of 360 days. Must be made up of a year which equals 360 days instead of 365. So 360 meaning 30 times 12. Did I get that right? Yeah, 36 times. Yeah, okay. So looking at this chart, that got me side-reeled for a moment. Apologize that. Looking at this chart, the point that's germane to what I was trying to get at is that as we begin to break down this Bible study or break down this particular topic, it's helpful to remember that most of what Daniel prophesied took place in the past, so it's under the water on the bridge now. It's history. And a lot of it was pointing towards a fulfillment in 70 AD, just like the preterists said. But the part where the preterists, the full-blown versions, the full preterists, the part where they get wrong is not allowing for the near-far aspect of prophecy. And so if we can allow that preterism really represents a lot of the near aspect and futurism represents a lot of the far aspect, then we can have some harmony between those two views and not have to always set them at odds with one another like many Bible teachers do. You don't have to be a full-blown preterist and reject futurism, and you don't have to be a full-blown futurist and reject preterism. What you can do, like I'm trying to do, is hold a bit of an eclectic view where most of the prophecies are future, like the book of Revelation, and yet a lot of Daniel is preterist in the sense that a lot of it was pointing to 70 AD. So there's near and far, and I don't believe that we need to have conflict between those two. So let's jump into some of the commentary. What I'm going to do first is borrow the notes from a gentleman by the name of Joel Richardson, who happens to be a futurist just like I am. You can find him on YouTube or on the internet, Joel Richardson. And he has a commentary on Daniel's 70 weeks, and he brings in this perspective of premillennial perspective versus non-premillennial when looking at the 70th week of Daniel. And the reason this is important for our study is because when we talk about premillennial, we're talking about the millennial kingdom at the far end of the chart here. Let me bring up a different chart that shows the millennium. You can see what I'm talking about. Do we want that one? Yeah, let's use that one. Give me a second. Okay, yeah, this is the one I want to use. So in this chart, the new heaven and the new earth at the far right is preceded but in other words, the darker green, is preceded by the 1,000-year kingdom age known as the millennium. That's what the word millennium refers to, as 1,000 years. There are those within Christianity and in Judaism who are looking forward to a literal 1,000-year time to come on planet Earth that's still yet future. Most of rabbinic Judaism falls into this camp. They're looking for a future 1,000-year millennial time where the Jews are going to enjoy worldwide influence, leadership, Torah will flourish in that time period, etc., etc. They're looking forward to a literal 1,000 years. Most of rabbinic Judaism is in that camp. Along with them are many who fall into the camp of dispensationalism, as well as what we refer to as premillennial. We're looking for a literal 1,000-year time. Many pre-tribbers are looking for a literal 1,000 years, as well as mid-tribbers and post-tribbers are looking for a literal 1,000-year time period. It's only that camp known as amillennial, which unfortunately largely represents Catholicism and many of its sister kind of denominations, like I think Lutherans and things like that. They represent what's known as amillennial, where they don't believe there's a literal 1,000 years at the far end of the age. They instead believe that we're kind of living in this spiritual kind of ethereal, non-temperamental millennial age. In other words, they believe that the number 1,000 is just merely symbolic. It doesn't really have a literal beginning and end or anything like that. It's not a marked off time on our calendar, like I believe it's literal. So why is that relevant to our study? Because in the premillennial perspective, then when we look at Daniel's prophecies, again, when we say premillennial, we're talking about Christ's second coming prior to the establishment and setting up of the millennium. That's what we mean by premillennial. His second coming is before the millennium. Okay, so premillennial. What we find is that if Daniel's prophecies are, if the 70 weeks are all premillennial, then we're looking for all of these details to be fulfilled in such a way that they are more literal in fashion. There's less spiritualization, less allegory going on, less kind of symbology going on. Symbology? Is that the really word? There's less of that going on. There's more, this is really historical, literal things are going to happen. Oddly enough, even the preterists are largely, as far as I can tell, are largely literal. I'm sorry, they're not literal millennial. They are amillennial, as far as I can tell. I mean, again, we'll do a study on preterism in a different day, separate study, maybe an excursus after we're done with all of this Book of Revelation and Daniel stuff, if the interest is there. However, again, we're going to see from Joel Richardson, the premillennial versus the amillennial is a very important distinction to make when it comes to studying prophecy. It locates you within a camp of Bible study, and so if you're of the opinion, no, there's no 1,000-year millennium, Christ is already here, the kingdom is already here, and we don't have to look forward to anything literal happening down the road, well then perhaps you're an amillennialist, perhaps you're a Catholic believer, something to that effect, maybe Lutheran. That might be why you don't hold to that perspective. On the other hand, if you believe in a literal 1,000 years like I do, perhaps that means you're a futurist, or perhaps that means you're a dispensationalist or an evangelical Christian, some Protestant Christian, something to that effect, or maybe you're just rabbinic Jewish. So let's now look at some of those details as they impact our study on this part of Daniel. This is going to prep us for a study that I'm eventually going to be using over the next few weeks, put together by a gentleman by the name of Pastor David Guzik. You remember his name from my Matthew study, where we talked about Matthew's what was the study on? Gosh, I'm drawing a blank. It was Book of Matthew, and I did the study, but I can't remember exactly. But it was the idea of looking at different Christian perspectives and then a messianic perspective. And at that time, we looked at John MacArthur, we looked at David Guzik, we looked at gotquestions.org. It's available on my website, the Matthew study. But in that time, we introduced a pastor by the name of David Guzik, who's written an entire commentary on the entire Bible. Wow, that's fantastic. I mean, I wish I was at that level in my walk with Messiah and my maturity in Christ to be able to, and my academic stature to be able to write a commentary on the entire Bible. I do have a commentary on the entire Torah, the first 5 books, which you can get on my website, but not the entire Bible. So David Guzik has his website entitled enduringword.com. He's got a commentary that is very, very easy to understand. It's got an outline format to it, and we're going to be using that as our study because I agree with most of what he writes here. But before we get there, let's look at Joel Richardson's talk about some of these details about the interpretive perspectives facing us when we're looking at the book of Daniel. I'll just read down through these, and then we'll call it quits for tonight. And then starting next week, we'll pick up here again. I'll probably read it one more time and then launch us forward into Pastor Guzik's study. But Joel Richardson has this study that's available online. I can't remember the name of his website, but I'll leave it in the little, maybe in the show notes or the YouTube comments below, in the details, the description. But here's what he has to say. When we're talking about the book of Daniel, and we're looking at it through the lens of certain perspectives, like the Jewish view, the preterist view, the premillennial view, the futurist view, et cetera, et cetera. Here are some of the details that he brings to the table that we're going to have to contend with. We have a heading known as the survey of the primary interpretive perspectives of this slice of scripture. We have first of all, point number A, the Jewish view. Number 1, the Messiah, the Prince in the prophecy is interpreted in a non-messianic manner by Jewish teachers and Jewish leaders. Number 2, the terminus ad quem, meaning the conclusion of the prophecy, is 70 AD. Notice that's very similar to the preterism, right? Which makes sense from a Jewish perspective. They're not going to read the book of Revelation, so they're not going to have any perspective that's futurist. They believe that all of Daniel, from their perspective, which is the end of prophetic books covering this topic. No, in other words, there's no Matthew for them. There's no First and Second Thessalonians for them. There's no book of Revelation. They don't need all that. They don't read all that. They do need it, but they don't read it. So for them, yeah, it makes sense that the end of the prophecy is 70 AD, just like the preterists say. Number 3, the subject of verse 27 is Vespasian, the Roman Caesar, or Titus, his son. That's their perspective. Under number 3, we have 5 teachers that are prominent who teach this Jewish view. There's Theodotion, there's Josephus, there's Rashi, there's Maimonides, and there's Japheth ben Ha-Levi. I think that's in the historical order that you would find them as well. So if this is your perspective from a Jewish view, this is probably why maybe you've read one of their commentaries like Rashi or Josephus or Theodotion, who wrote a major translation to the Septuagint, right? The LXX Greek translation of the Old Testament. Theodotion is an author who supplied one of those translations. Of course, you've probably all heard of Rashi and Maimonides, right? These are perspectives that you'll find if you read their writings. Moving along, point number C. I just realized that he skipped B. I don't know why he skipped B. It must have been some kind of a typo on his part, but it says C. I would have put it as B. I mean, it goes from A to C. That doesn't make sense. I'll write into Mr. Richardson and ask him. But the preterist view, the view that I don't hold to when it comes to full-blown hyper-preterism, I do not hold to this view, but it's simply labeled the preterist view by most teachers. Point number one, Messiah the Prince is interpreted as messianic. Yeah, that makes sense, because the preterist view is largely a Christian view. It's a Christian perspective. It's just different from the futurist view. Messiah the Prince in the prophecy that we read about, Daniel 9:24-27, Messiah the Prince is interpreted as messianic, as opposed to the Jewish view where he's not messianic per se. Now, Joel says that is interpreted as non-messianic, but when I read through Rashi, I find that Rashi says Messiah, but maybe he doesn't mean Jesus the Messiah. He means a Messiah or something like that. But definitely the Jewish view is not Jesus the Messiah, and definitely the preterist view is often Jesus the Messiah when it talks about Messiah the Prince. There are some versions of this prophecy where it is not Messiah the Prince, such as Chris White, who's a Christian author. He believes that the Messiah the Prince here, I believe, is not Jesus. He believes it's referring to someone else. We'll talk about that in time. But moving along with the preterist view, point number 2, the terminus ad quem, i.e. the ending point. That's what the Latin means there. Terminus ad quem is the ending. The beginning is terminus a quo. So terminus ad quem, the ending is 70 AD, again, similar to the Jewish view. The subject of verse 27 is either Jesus, Vespasian, or Titus. Again, the preterist view has a lot of similarities to the Jewish view here. Makes sense. Prominent teachers who hold this view, you can see them there. Philip Morrow, James Jordan, John Evans, R.D. Smith, and Dr. Kelly Nelson Burks. I might add, I believe that, what's his name? R.C. Sproul, I believe he's also a preterist. I need to, don't confirm it just yet, but I believe in passing, I believe in memory that R.C. Sproul, a prominent Christian teacher, I believe he's also a preterist. But then we have the amillennialist view. This is held to by a lot of Catholics and Lutherans, if I remember. Number 1, the term Messiah the Prince is interpreted as messianic, meaning referring to Jesus. Number 2, the weeks are often understood in a non-literal manner, like the historicist view on that chart, a non-literal manner. So the weeks are all symbolic, 70 weeks, 69 weeks, 62 weeks. All that is symbolic language. It doesn't have to be literally 49 years or 483 years or 7 years. All of that's just symbolic. So 70 weeks are all symbolic. Number 3, the terminus ad quem, the ending point, is either 70 AD or the return of Jesus. Again, this is the amillennialist view. Borrow some themes from the preterist view. The subject of verse 27 is either Christ or Titus. So there's, again, some similarities, some overlap. Some prominent people that you may have heard of that hold this view. Church Father Clement of Alexandria, Church Father Origen, and Church Father Augustine. They all held to this, what we might call amillennialist view, a view that I don't hold to myself. All right. And then speaking of Augustine, John Calvin's on that list as well. But speaking of Augustine, there's a quote, all of the prophecy of the 70 weeks was fulfilled at Christ's first advent. Therefore, it is not to be expected that the events will occur again at the second advent. That's a quote from Augustine. John Calvin, who's also an amillennialist, right? John Calvin, you guys are familiar with John Calvin. Here's a quote from John Calvin. He says, without the slightest doubt, this prophecy was fulfilled when the city was captured and overthrown and the temple utterly destroyed by Titus, the son of Vespasian. So again, that's an amillennialist perspective by a famous Christian by the name of John Calvin. But more on the list, C.F. Keel, H.C. Leupold, Edward J. Young, and Joyce Baldwin. These are more modern authors who are amillennialists. And then lastly on this list is the view that I myself hold to, as does the author of this paper, Joel Richardson himself. He is also a premillennialist. Premillennial, again, it refers to the second coming of Christ before the establishment of a literal 1,000-year millennial reign on planet Earth. Premillennial. So I'm a pre-wrath premillennialist. That's what I hold to. But the point is, under premillennialists, and then we'll close with this tonight. Number 1, the term Messiah the Prince is interpreted as messianic, meaning it's referring to Jesus. So with Daniel's prophecy of those 4 verses, Jesus is in there. It uses the word Mashiach a few different times. Messiah, the Hebrew word for Messiah, Mashiach, usually translated as Christ. Interestingly, is that the Greek word is not Christos in this version. It's a different word. But we'll look at that in time. But Messiah is definitely Jesus, Messiah the Prince. The terminus ad quem, i.e. the ending point, is the future return of Christ, meaning still future to us, as in still has not yet happened yet. So it's still around the corner. Number 3, the subject of verse 27 is the Antichrist, right? As opposed to, if you remember, others say it's either Christ or Titus. Some say it's the Roman Caesar, Vespasian, or Titus. But premillennialists too. I might qualify this. Joel Richardson says that the subject of verse 27 is Antichrist. I do agree with him that it is Antichrist, but with the near-far aspect of this prophecy, the near person that's in the prophecy is Titus, who destroyed the temple and the city, but the far aspect of the person who's going to destroy the city or have a heavy impact on Jerusalem and its temple in the future is the Antichrist. owing to the fact that Antiochus Epiphanes, as well as Titus, are both types and shadow of an Antichrist figure. The subject of verse 27 in proper is the Antichrist of the future, but it's there's also the Titus figure in the prophecy that was in verse 26, as well as a little bit of Antiochus Epiphanes is in there as well. So they're kind of all mashed together because of the type and shadow aspect, or the near not yet, or now not yet, near far aspect. But prominent people who have held to this particular premillennial view, and then I'll close with this. We have Church Father Irenaeus, Church Father Hippolytus, and then we move on to more modern teachers: Gleason Archer Jr., Stephen R. Miller, Leon Wood, and John Walvoord. Most of you have probably heard of some of those names, right? Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Archer, Miller, Wood, and Walvoord. And that'll do it for our study as we take a bite out of Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. That'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.